But when it comes to the idea that there actually could be aspects of these things, these craft, that are just physical, tangible, nuts and bolts pieces that we can get our hands on, then we have to question, how do we analyze these things? How do we look at this stuff and determine if it really is special? Because I imagine that these beings, they may be non-physical to us one moment, physical the next, non-physical the next. So if we could catch them at that point when they're physical, maybe we'll keep them. Same thing with these craft. These craft must be altering space and time in order for them to disappear in the blink of an eye. And since we know space and time is flexible, it's not very hard to imagine. You know, a clock in your basement runs slower than a clock in your attic because the one in your basement is closer to the Earth's gravitational field. It's not by much at all, but it shows that time doesn't mean a lot. So if we get a hold of these pieces of these craft that might be real, how do we know how to test them? Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Well, I received a box of supposedly crashed UFO debris a few weeks ago. And this coming month, March, our brand new laboratory is going to be operational. We've been working for years to get this laboratory up and running. And we have all kinds of tests we're going to do with this debris. Because you see, so far, if somebody finds something they think is crashed UFO debris, usually they just send it off and they have somebody sit down and scan it and try to figure out what it's made of. And they can come back with a report that says, I've never seen this before, can't explain this. And everybody goes, isn't that interesting? And then what? We got to start getting creative here. Well, let me tell you what we've been playing around with. There is a gentleman named Chuck Wade who lives in New Mexico. And his father was so close to the famous Roswell crash site that his father got a visit from Mac Brazel, the rancher, inviting him to come over and look at the wreckage. And Chuck's father said, nah, no thanks. Biggest mistake he probably ever made. Chuck was fascinated by this. And so he, years later, started going out and looking for crashed debris. And he said that it's well known among the locals there that there have been a number of crashes. Not just that one famous one that we all talk about where Jesse Marcel was involved. So Chuck found a site around St. Augustine, which is not too far from Roswell, New Mexico, where he collected some pieces of what looked to be out-of-place debris. He did not know what he had, didn't know if this was extraterrestrial perhaps, interdimensional perhaps, or if this was something that was part of a government experiment, like Project Mogul, one of these targets, didn't know. He sent it off to some labs, and Chuck said that the labs told him that this was the purest form of aluminum they'd ever seen, and that they had no precedent for this type of aluminum occurring naturally on Earth or being manufactured on Earth. That's what the lab says. I don't know. I'm looking into that to see if all that's true. But he said he went to present this to the UFO community, and very few people even wanted to look at it. And I said, you're kidding me. I cannot believe that. The UFO community is the most open-minded community in the world, right? And he said, I don't know, for some reason, people don't think there's anything I can do. I tell them the results, and they say, that's interesting. I said, well, why don't you send me some of this stuff? So he sent me a box. I opened it up, and there are 12 samples of this material in there. So I got my team together. I'm the president of Lemur Paranormal Investigations. Stands for the League of Energy, Materialization, and Unexplained Phenomena Research. So we decided just to play around with this stuff a little bit. So we took a little piece of this debris that looked very much like a little piece of commercial foil, except it's denser, and yet it's thinner, if that makes any sense. It's probably about half the thickness of commercial foil, but there's a certain denseness to it. And I took a Van de Graaff generator, and I put that Van de Graaff generator down on the floor with a pie pan on top of it. And of course, the Van de Graaff is the type that has the big dome on top, and you know, it's the kind that'll make your hair stand on end if you put your hand on it. And then we just threw this debris in there. And after we threw the debris on there, it stood up on end and began to rotate at a high rate of speed. Now, I am very familiar with electrostatics. I've been giving electrostatics demonstrations since I was in middle school. And my colleagues and I were taking all kinds of other pieces of foil as controls. And yes, you can get them to stand up and do interesting things. But the stability of this particular piece was incredible. It would always spin in the same direction. It would stay there for 10 or 15 minutes. You could pluck it out of the field of positive ions, toss it back in. It would go to the exact same spot and continue spinning. Incredibly stable. Almost, at times, it would even levitate, barely even touching the pan. Now, I'm not saying that this is some type of enormous breakthrough for science, but it is kind of cool. So we got another little piece of this stuff that was even thicker, about the size of my fingernail, and we put it on top of the Van de Graaff machine, and when it was in one position, you would get a nice wide spray of blue electrical corona that would come out of the top of this piece of metal. Then you'd flip it over and it'd start sparking and boom, propel itself off of the Van de Graaff. We do it over and over, and every time got the same result. In one position, nice big blue cone of electrostatic discharge. Other position, spark, 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 boom, propels it right off of the machine. Now this is just playing around in my kitchen. We're starting the serious experiments in March. Nothing more to be explored. They're not very inspiring at very least. I think that we know just such a tiny little chunk of what's out there. It's insane and irresponsible for some of these arrogant, smug people to get out there and try to dismiss the fact that we can make headway here if we think creatively. Don't sit around waiting for the government to disclose anything. You know, maybe they will disclose, you know, microbial life somewhere one of these days. But the government's job, you know, the job of intelligence is to keep secrets, right? They're not going to tell you. You've got to get out there as civilians and think creatively and resourcefully and do it yourself. So I don't know what's real, but I can tell you what a crude fake is. People send me this stuff to analyze all the time. Always be suspicious if it's seen at night. Because, again, that hides so much of the lift mechanism. Now, I'm not saying that you should pull one of these out, because Ed's over here like, no, that's not. I'm talking about look at the whole combination of these, okay? It's a combination of factors you need to consider. If it's seen at night, it could be hooked to balloons. It could be hooked to a variety of things that are designed to be invisible by somebody who's trying to fake this or hoax it. Number two, if it seems to have a very light density or low weight. You get a sense after a while when you look at enough of these things that are dangling off of balloons, that are being propelled, that are hot air lifted, whatever. You get a sense of how much weight they have in terms of how they move with the currents. Always be suspicious of things that just seem a little bit unstable. Number three, it's suspicious if that stability is especially bobbing, obviously, with the air. Now, this is kind of common sense stuff. You see the wind blowing the trees, and it seems to be responding. Number four, it makes no noise. Be suspicious of that. Now, I'm not talking about little lights up in the sky. I'm talking about things you get a good look at, like I pointed out in the beginning of the program. If it makes no noise, then that is another sign it could be something like helium or hot air, because things that make noise are usually heavier. And on a low budget, your next door hoaxer, he's not going to be able to go out and afford to create something that uses a propulsion system that makes noise. Number five, it has no effect on the ground. when it flies over your truck is not going to break down. You're not going to have radiation on the ground. You're not going to have any type of sign that there is a field being produced. Which brings to mind something interesting that my friend Jim Mars often says.